having a Zoom board meeting. My wife had a question of me and my dog was barking. I turned off the video and the sound to address those issues. Our remote, disconnected digital platforms and world allow us to do that. And it's just wrong. And we have to get back to the reality of what professional experience is, and that's being present.
CEO Voices, Leading with Communication, examines the communication that enables transformational leadership. In this episode, we speak with General Charles Pede, former Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, who shares insights on the role executive communication played in leading the world's largest and most powerful law firm.
Hello, General Pede. Thank you for joining us today. Our podcast, CEO Voices, is focused on the communication aspect of leadership. Chuck, your field certainly is one where words matter. Could you tell us a little bit about the JAG Corps and your fundamental mission?
Yes, good morning. The JAG Corps, the Army JAG Corps, like all the service JAG Corps, are built to provide day-to-day direct legal support to commanders, soldiers, and their families. Each of the services has one. They're built at different sizes and structures, but the Army, the one I led as the Judge Advocate General for 4 years, is composed of about 10,000 soldiers, lawyers, and paralegals. And we're spread around the world in about 74 legal offices, some large, some very small. Headquarters is in D.C., where I led the Corps. But they provide day-to-day counsel to commanders on what they can shoot and what they can shoot the enemy with, to how to spend money to a family that comes in and needs support with landlord-tenant issues, or contract issues to provide an aerobic instructor at the gym, or frankly, what to do with someone who refuses a COVID shot, for example. That all requires legal advice, face-to-face legal advice with people making decisions, sometimes life and death, but that's done around the world constantly by trained Army lawyers, about 6,000 between the National Guard, the Army Reserve, and the active Army JAG Corps. That pretty much sums up the business.
Chuck, before we get into your leadership communication approach at the U.S. Army JAG Corps, can you walk us through your nearly 40-year military career and tell us what were some of the key milestones for you along the way?
Sure. I was an Army ROTC graduate. Out of undergraduate at UVA, I took an educational delay and went to law school. But the most formative, I'll just simply describe the jobs that I consider the most formative in my time, that had the greatest impact, I think, as a senior leader, communicator, once I was responsible for the entire law firm. The first being a defense counsel. I was a defense counsel in Germany for 2 years, and that essentially taught me the importance of a balanced adversarial system. And it created a confidence in me, but it also created in me the importance of confidence in those around the system, that they believed the criminal justice process was fair. My next job in my mind, of importance was as a prosecutor. And that, frankly, taught me courage, confidence, a lot of humility, and the value of preparation and sheer hard work for which there is no substitute. Those two jobs were critical, formative jobs. I then moved into some mid-management jobs in our Corps. One was as an assignments officer for what I call our law firm, which is the JAG Corps, another term for the JAG Corps. Mid-management job, really human relations. And it taught me the business end of the practice of law and a lot about people. The most important lesson I found is that for about 80% of our workforce, whatever the workforce might be, one, you can't make everyone happy. And that generally was about 80% of my law firm. And two, you can never give them enough. And I know that might sound cynical, but I think if we all recognize as leaders, then our appetites and our ambitions and our expectations can be moderated with some level of sanity. And then the third lesson in HR is let things cook. Let decisions cook for a while before you jump. Consider them, let them gestate for a bit, and then make your decision. Very critical. Another couple of critical assignments, and I'll close, was as a staff judge advocate. And in the Army, that's the term for the senior lawyer responsible for the delivery of legal services within a certain geographic region. And I ran a legal office at Fort Drum. I deployed with portions of that office to Afghanistan twice. And I learned in that job, which was formative. Again, I learned how to practice law and deliver legal advice through others. That's when you start to learn sort of distant management and leadership and how to communicate so that people can take your message and method of practice or the method of business and do it when you're not there to your standard and expectation. I learned how to grow lawyers. And I think it was the first time I learned the importance of relationships.
One of the things June and I constantly talk about in our class with our students is that they need to embrace those philosophies as well, and those practices, I should say, because the world is changing so incredibly fast and things are so complicated, and you just have to find time for self-care and for renewal in order to be effective, especially in times of just such incredible change that we're seeing today. And that's not going to abate, as you know. I'm sure you've just seen the pace during the course of your tenure leading the JAG Corps. So much change taking place, right? Changes in military law, rules of engagement, changes in technology, changes in communication channels, changes in public sentiment, congressional sentiment, expectations among Corps members and their families. How did you go about prioritizing your communication and outreach to so many different stakeholders? Because you have a lot of stakeholders that you've got to reach and that you've got to cover and you've got to satisfy. So curious about that process.
I would tell you it was very deliberate, and I think all senior leaders need to be very deliberate about it. There's a bit of react on contact to any environment, which means you're never going to anticipate everything, every stakeholder, every equity, but there's certainly a bit of planning. And we as a team and the larger team committed to that notion that we are a standalone body and have something important to say to people on our own. And in order to do that, it requires resources. And that is the resources which we determined that we never fully committed to were people and authority for those people. And by people, I mean, when you look at a lot of organizations, everybody already has a job. So if you don't have an office that's responsible for strategic communications, you're just borrowing and stealing from others who have a full-time job already. So you got to cleave people away and build the structure. You've got to have the machinery. You've got to have the structure that has nothing else but to strategically communicate and think about that as a task. And so we'd never done that really as a organization of 10,000 around the world. And so we committed to building the tool, the Office of Strategic Communications. And then once having done that, this is all a bit simultaneous, but I'm just doing it in a linear way. We identified both internal comms and external comms, constituencies. Internal was our law firm. How were we going to talk to them, cultivate them, grow them, teach them, mentor, set priorities, let them know what we thought was important? That was issue one for us. And then externally, we had Army leaders, leadership spread around the world, warfighters. We had allies, Brits, Australians, Germans, French, all sorts of folks. And then we had writers who are constantly writing about the law, what they think the law says, which is a critical, vexing issue for me. And then non-governmental organizations like the International Committee for the Red Cross, which is a wonderful organization. But there are many things that they espouse about which I disagree fundamentally about what the law says. And so it's important for me to preach that. And so we prioritized fundamentally after we identified these constituencies, partly by establishing the importance of each of those constituencies and the distinctive message for each, and then who, literally, which leader at what echelon would deliver that message.
Chuck, I'll have to say, as a professional communicator, it warms my heart that you were intentional and deliberate about establishing an Office of Strategic Communication. And I think for any of our leaders who will be listening to this program who are, going through that kind of mental process in their mind, whether they're thinking about, hey, we need this or we've got this, but we need to strengthen it. Your comments were invaluable. I do have to ask you though, sir, in this process, in this decision making to go this route, what did you find to be the hardest part? Was it just kind of giving up a little control, if you will, or acknowledging that, oh gosh, this is going to be another demand on my time? I'm just curious about what the most challenging aspect was for you in doing that.
Resourcing. You have to take good people out of really good jobs and have them do something they've never done before. And that means you're uncovering those jobs. So somebody's under strength somewhere, they don't have the same resources. So that's hard to do. It's also hard to get people to accept them because they now are exercising your authority. And the broader legal community, in my mind, my community's legal community, they had to accept that this was their mission and that they were speaking for me. And so when they go to a division chief or a staff judge advocate in the field and ask for something or tell them something's going to happen, there's a cultural time lapse that has to occur for that to reach normalcy. And so there's a bit of time that occurs where there's resistance, and then there's reluctant acceptance, and then there's, well, we've always done it this way. And that simply takes persistence and time and drum beating. And it's those early phases of resistance that requires as a senior leader, your personal engagement. And that's why I would write about their mission. I would go out and speak about their mission. I would talk about them as individuals and jobs, as all my leaders would, to reinforce their mission and to reinforce their legitimacy. That has to be done, or they become simply a parasite, an unwanted presence in a meeting.
I totally agree with what Steve said. As professional communicators, Chuck, what I've seen in strategic plans and strategic planning is the lack of any kind of communication strategic plan or an aspect of the strategic plan and communication. And you've just so eloquently communicated that to us, how important it is to have that Office of Strategic Communication, making sure that when the plan is executed, that it's executed in the right way, internally and externally. And I've just found that lacking in our some of the ways that we teach strategic planning and strategic execution.
I think I would add to that. What you'll find is I would integrate the substantive master. Let's say it's the personnel law or the criminal law expert, and they would prepare a message for me. And then I would I'd filter it with the strategic initiatives or communications officer. And their job with a different lens would be to understand this isn't rocket science or novel. I'm just sure I'm repeating something somebody else learned already, but they would filter it to the audience that it was going to. And then I would ultimately filter both messages, not to water it down so much, but to make it personal, but also to address not only the substantive experts' adamant substantive desires that I communicate, but the moderating understandings of the strategic communicator so that I wouldn't alienate certain aspects of the audience. And it's the blending of those expertises that is critical to a senior leader. If you're not getting that input, you're getting at least half of what you need, or at most you're getting half of what you need, if that makes sense.
What was the story, Ed's point, that you really wanted to tell, and how did you go about disseminating that story to the core?
The overarching narrative that we identified and developed was, one, we're the world's best law firm. And I chose law firm vice JAGCOR because JAGCOR is an important historical element and appellation for my law firm. But I wanted to use the word law firm as a strategic mnemonic, if you will, or technique, simply to remind all my members that they were first and foremost lawyers. Because when you're a soldier and a lawyer, you can sometimes lose sight of the fact that the only reason you are there in that formation is to deliver legal advice. It's cool and sexy to do all the stuff we do, but if you're not doing your legal stuff and that's not your priority, you've lost sight. So I wanted the first message to be we're the world's best law firm, and we are, quite simply. The second message was we have 4 constants, and we set this up deliberately. We have 4 constants that set us apart and guide us in the practice of law day in and day out. And they are simply principled counsel. We provide what right looks like to all leaders. There's that famous quote, in matters of fashion, swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock. That was my message to people. Do the right thing when no one's looking with your legal advice. And so principled counsel number 1, substantive mastery. Nobody wants you to get 80% of the answers correct. You have to be 100% all the time, and that's hard work. So we focused on substantive mastery of the law. Selfless service was number 3. We wanted everyone to be constantly reminded that one of our constants was selflessness, others before self. And then finally, stewardship of the profession of law, which means cultivating those around you, not being selfish about your own development, but making sure the law and the lawyers and paralegals around you are developed. And we were deliberate about this message, how we developed it. And we actually, we created a visual. We created a compass. We had a compass, and we just put the 4 points around the compass. And then it, as things evolve, it became a compass rose, one of them fancy things you see on a beautiful nautical map. And so as the product developed, the communication product developed, its imagery developed, which is an important aspect of product iteration and when you're making iPhones, but it's also important to product iterate in your communication message.
That brings up a point you made earlier, Chuck, about distant management and leadership. That resonated with me, and you mentioned during the pandemic, but this was way before the pandemic. You've been operating in a role of distant management and leadership for your entire career, something that our students who are going into the workforce are looking at now, and it just seems to me that that's something that I'd like to hear more, how you managed that. You said that when you're not there, you still have to have people working up to your standards and expectations. And how did you do that in a very distant management and leadership environment?
You have to pick good leaders who will spread that gospel and that you trust and know. And that means the TJ had the blessing of being able to select the leaders that would lead offices around the world. And then in our system, of course, we promote leaders as well. And you'd never know everyone, but you're looking for qualities of leadership and lawyering. And so there's part of it is the HR piece. Who is leading and responsible for people? But they've also got to have a good message to deliver, June. And I think that's why you got to spend time on content. And hopefully that content sustains the remote nature of the leadership. So if the content is strong enough, like our 4 constants, and it's consistently the 4 constants, if we product iterated, so it's 4 constants this year and then something new next year, honestly, that doesn't work. If your constants aren't constant, they're vacuous. There's no meat to them. So to your point, how do you do it? You do it through others. You do it through travel. You do it through personal contact, saturation. It's more than a full-time job, but you've got to be out there, even if it's remote. You're not there for the counseling session, but you give them the confidence that the message is the same.
And that underscores another major point that you made is about preparation. You talk about the value of preparation. How do you prepare for difficult discussions? And I'm sure you've had many of those.
You surround yourself with good people, people that are willing and able to speak candidly. And so there's a couple elements of that. One, you've got to find good people. They're not easy to find in this sense, people who will speak their mind candidly. There's a lot of great lawyers and leaders, but there's far fewer who are candid with senior leaders. I don't care how affable, how nonchalant, how casual you might try and create a meeting setting. There's still a barrier between the CEO, or in my case, the TJ, and the major, the 5-7 year professional on your staff. And you got to look for people who are willing to speak up and speak their mind, and then you have to reinforce them. It doesn't mean you need to adopt their recommendation. You just need to let them talk. Reminder, you're not the smartest person in the room. Listen twice as much as you talk. That's why God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Chuck, you just explained the Darden case method classroom. It's exactly what we try and do. And certainly in today's environment, we are very much, our mantra is civil discourse, and you're exactly right. We want students to be able to sit around a boardroom table at some point in their careers and give candid feedback. So thank you very much for underscoring the Darden case method.
And the best add-on to that, June, is to have a red team, which probably everyone's familiar with. But there's got to be somebody in the room. You can designate them beforehand or in the middle of the meeting and give them the red card. Say, okay, you're the devil's advocate. How are we screwed up? What are we not seeing here? That's your job in this meeting.
Chuck, your tenure of leadership at the Corps spanned 2 very different administrations, in the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and 2 very different approaches to governance, I would think. And this is not a political question intended to be so, but I'm just curious about how these 2 administrations, starkly different in many ways, how did that impact your engagement with the administrations, and for that matter, your engagements with Congress during these 2 different types of administrations? Did it impact your approach at all?
The reality of a service in the executive department, for example, a branch within the executive department, like Department of Defense and the services within the Department of Defense, it has more to do with the life within that department, which is a way of saying we don't have a lot at the service level. We don't have a lot of contact with the White House. We see the ripple effect. So we see the Office of Secretary of Defense and DOD trying to navigate the new priorities between administrations. And so there's a whipsaw effect. And that whipsaw effect is a ripple effect down to the services. And it can be dramatic. And so the mantra between the entire transition process between administrations is always, especially legally, it is always, we follow the law as given us, and we're apolitical. And so that has to be the understanding. The dilemma you have, and the reality you have, is the 11th hour of the departing administration is filled with the execution of policies they were unable to achieve in the first 10 hours. That is 3.5+ years. And so you see this massive amount of essentially paperwork, normally in policy, that the secretary will sign at the 11th hour, and then we have to execute. And then the new administration comes in, and there's this pause. Well, will the new administration undo these policies? And that takes often 6 to 12 months for that to happen.
Wow.
Just because of the procedures process, a lot of things going on, a lot of priorities, which one's most important. And so where the services end up is trying to figure out, okay, I've got this policy from previous administration that we're required in due faith and good faith to execute. What do we do? And the answer is, that's the law right now. That's our policy. We have to execute unless somebody says, no, pause. And so that requires a tremendous amount of leadership, especially if it's in the social fabric policy of the organization. And you'll remember this probably most viscerally or visibly in the trans issues that occurred, whether we were going to allow trans soldiers or not between administrations, and that policy went back and forth. But we had obligations to to enforce certain policies until we were given guidance otherwise. So that to me is a significant departure and difficulty between administrations. It requires leadership, agnostic leadership. It's apolitical, and you've got to follow the law as a servant of the law and to comport with your oath as an officer. And that can be challenging when your civilian overseers aren't charged with the same obligations. And that is the new civilian leadership.
General, you've talked a lot about in the past about rules of engagement shifting in terms of conflict and conflict issues. I guess they always are throughout the course of history of military engagement, but I'm thinking over the last several years, it's probably expedited quite a bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And I guess maybe perhaps more importantly, what do we as business leaders, communication leaders here in the U.S. need to better understand about current conflict risks and how they could impact our near and long-term future?
Great question, Steve. I would offer this. We've spent the last 3 decades fighting primarily precision strike, counter-terror, and counterinsurgency wars on what we would refer to as non-linear battlefields. And that's just what we've been doing for the last 20 to 30 years. So we have, including myself, a generation of leaders and warfighters who grew up on a diet of highly constrained rules of engagement. And rules of engagement are the rules by which you can use force on a battlefield, who you can shoot, what you can shoot at them with, and when and where you can shoot at them. And so these rules can be highly constrictive, and properly so. They're all laudable and necessary constraints in a counterinsurgency or counterterrorism operation, where you often cannot tell the difference between a terrorist and a farmer, or a woman walking with her children through a market and she might have an AK underneath her burqa. That's an appropriate set of restraints because of those limitations. You don't know who your enemy is until they show themselves. So war fighting in that kind of environment requires immense discernment and restraint. But conversely, in peer-to-peer war fighting, as we see in Ukraine now, the use of force is altogether different. And it has to be. Seconds count, which means if you don't shoot, in many cases, you're already dead. And so the upshot is the rules of war are less constrained by policy and more controlled by the basics of the law of armed conflict. And so you think of the rules of engagement in Afghanistan as having to thread an eye of a needle, but the rules of engagement in Ukraine as a doorway, maybe even perhaps a French doorway, a double door. The laws of war that we're accustomed to that we see in Ukraine are far more destructive than we're accustomed to, and that's natural, but we have to overcome that.
How do you communicate these values that you're just talking about and purposes to your brand new young lawyers coming into the service? These are incredibly talented men and women who could easily have taken a different path and outside service to their country and be very comfortable financially. How do you begin to, perhaps the word is shape, the values and mentality that is needed for a young JAG lawyer to operate in the environment that you just talked to us about?
And I think, Jen, this is true for any environment. It could be an insurance company, it could be a sales company of some kind, but you have to spend time with them. Senior leaders need to be there. You have to make yourself available, talk with them, learn what's on their mind, write and communicate, set an example of what you expect. These are hard things to do when you're trying to manage a large organization. But if you don't set the standard and ask your leadership team to be doing the same, you've really failed. You have to set the bar high on yourself, but also on your people through those conversations. And this sounds a bit odd to have to say it out loud, but it's important for CEOs to think about this. You have to make sure it looks like you're enjoying your job. And you have to make sure it looks like you're enjoying your time with those junior, in my case, officers. Authenticity is critical. And we know you're always on. Leaders are always on. And so you may not want to be on. You may not want to be there, but part of leadership is overcoming your personal desires for the greater good.
I have another couple questions for you, sir. Obviously you're a double who. I would even consider you a triple who. You got your undergraduate degree from UVA. You got your law degree from UVA. You led operations at the schoolhouse, as I've heard you refer to it, which is the JAG school, the law school. For those that don't know, the Army Judge Advocate General Law School is adjacent to the UVA Law School, and General Pede led that administration as well. I wonder if you could talk about your formative years at UVA, leading all the way to your leadership at the schoolhouse, and what were some of those moments, and what you've walked away with that has been sticky for you, that has had an imprint on your leadership, on the essence of your leadership, if you will.
I had to develop my skills through hard work to at least match the overmatch of those who humbled me. And that was a driving factor for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had to develop my skills in collaboration to get anywhere. And that meant developing relationships and trust between people. And then I think the most important for anyone in any business, but especially for lawyers, I had to overcome my fear of failure, embarrassment, which causes you to avoid things, whether it's a trial. Should I get my client to plead guilty so I don't have to do voir dire with a jury? Those kinds of motivations go through people's minds. They may not admit it, but that's all driven by fear of embarrassment. And so you have to overcome those things. Or a social engagement. I don't want to go into that big room and try and find somebody who's willing to talk to me. That's embarrassment and fear of failure. I don't think we ever overcome that. So we just continue to work at it through our professional life and social life. But I use as my stock phrase, do not take counsel of your fears. And that's what always pushed me sort of over the edge. Patton is attributed to having said that, do not take counsel of your fears. And so you go into the good night bravely and you get after it. And if you don't have your friend or your boss there to push you into the room, you need to do it yourself. And so those were my lessons, I think, as a triple who, as you describe it. All through failure.
Yeah.
Those definitely are words of wisdom for our students and our learning community who has been listening to this podcast today. Chuck, thank you so very much. Your themes of preparation, the value of preparation, the idea of relationships and trust, getting to know people, working with new employees, having consistent communication, all are the mainstays of excellent and quality leadership.
Absolutely. Just to build on that, Chuck, any final thoughts, words of wisdom to our MBA's faculty and broader learning community here at Darden?
I've got two thoughts, and I'll try and make them quick. I would tell everyone without any reservation that we're in a state of professional compromise right now. We've ceded the ground to a state of disconnectedness, primarily because of the pandemic. The conveniences, and I air quote that, of the pandemic have allowed us to rationalize remote relationships and work. I just saw something in the Wall Street Journal. Farmers Insurance said, hey, you got to come back to work, and the employees are in revolt. And he only asked for 3 days back to work. Like the impact on our kids and school and learning, we'll reap in my mind, the unpleasant effects of this disconnectedness in due time. But in my mind, we need a wake-up call. We need something to jar us, literally like a good parent counseling, to the reality that presence matters, not 3 days. It matters in all things, that we cannot phone it in. Presence in law or anything builds relationships and magnifies our learning. We learn most and best by being around others, present, watching, engaging. In my mind, we learn our social graces, our ability to establish rapport, how to build a relationship, and in my case, how to be a good lawyer by being with other people, other lawyers. You cannot do it from home. We can rationalize it till the cows come home, but it doesn't happen. Case in point, quickly. Why did I agree to this podcast? Was it because Darden called me? Or was it because Steve and June called me? It's because Steve and June called, and I have a relationship with them, and I trust them. That's why I agreed to it. Absent a relationship, I don't know Darden from Adam's cat. So it's the relationship that matters. Second, I sit on a foundation board. We were having a Zoom board meeting. My wife had a question of me, and my dog was barking. I turned off the video and the sound to address those issues in a board meeting. That's unacceptable. But our remote, disconnected digital platforms and world allow us to do that. And it's just wrong. And we have to say it. We just have to acknowledge it. And we have to get back to the reality of what professional experience is, and that's being present. My second thought, which is somewhat of a continuation, and I'll close. Our digital world gives us the illusion of efficiency and connectedness, and it achieves most of the time quite the opposite. Mm-hmm. It is darn efficient in 5 minutes to knock out 5 emails and a couple text messages with a few taskings, instead of wasting 5 minutes and getting up from your chair, going to the next office and having a face-to-face conversation, which in the end is far more beneficial to both individuals, whether you like the outcome of that conversation or not, far more beneficial than 5 emails and a few text messages. And I'm not saying do one or the other. I'm saying we have to have balance. I'm all about balance. I've got an electric car. I get it. I'm in the digital world. I use my iPhone all the time. It's balance. It's a bit like David Brooks' book when he talked about resume virtues and eulogy virtues. You don't want one or the other exclusively. You got to have a balance of both of them. So when we think about our digital tools, they're designed to make us more efficient, but they make us less efficient, more transactional, less relationship oriented. And we have to recognize it, jar ourselves, shake ourselves out of the complacency of these tools and get up from our chairs and go see people. That's my message. That's my last thought.
This whole notion of executive presence and leadership presence in this particular time in history could not be more invaluable. So thank you, Chuck. We really, really appreciate the generosity of your time today.
Thank you, Chuck. We value your friendship as well, and we appreciate you being on our podcast today. Thank you.
I thank you both, and Darden.
CEO Voices examines the communication that enables transformational leadership. June West is Associate Professor of Business Administration and co-founder of the Darden Leadership Communication Council, along with her colleague, Steve Soltis. Soltis is the former head of executive communication at the Coca-Cola Company and lectures at Darden. This podcast is a production of the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.